Joining us now, NASA Ambassador Tony Rice, who is a friend of the Carolina Weather Group. He is a friend of the Weather Brains. I think he's a friend of every broadcast meteorologist from coast to coast. So, Tony, we're very glad you're able to hop on with us tonight. We have a lot we want to talk about, but I need to ask you first about SpaceX Starship. And I'm going to read this tweet. I'm sorry. I'm going to read this X. I got to get it right if it's Elon we're talking about. From this morning to make sure I understand exactly what happened. The booster experienced a rapid unscheduled disassembly shortly after stage separation, while Starship's engines fired for several minutes on its way to space. Is that the PR way of saying oopsies?
That's the PR way of saying that it blowed up real good. And something we need to understand about SpaceX, they do things a little bit differently. A lot of space companies, you talk to SpaceX fans, they'll call it the space old guard or something like that. They tend to break their testing up into individual segments and then bring it all together for kind of a final plugs out or whatever test. SpaceX doesn't work that way. They want to test as much as possible. So this unscheduled disassembly was kind of expected. I don't think they expected to get fully to orbit. I don't think they expect absolutely everything to work. And all that being said, every test has got to have a series of objectives. And my understanding is they met all of those objectives. And simply by having an intact launch pad post-launch is a great improvement over the last launch, where literally those 35 Raptor engines literally tore that pad apart. So they learned a lot from that and they corrected that. So, hats off to them.
It is quite literally rocket science. And I say that not ironically, because it is hard. Every space program in the history of human existence has had its own unscheduled disassembly of rocket parts. And so SpaceX is trying to do something new here. They obviously have done a whole lot with their crewed missions, their uncrewed missions to the International Space Station, and of course Starlink, which I got to tell you, at work I wrote one story that says, what are those dots in the sky? And then we explained it. Every time someone in the country somewhere sees dots moving across the sky, you can see that web article suddenly blip back up onto the board of clicks, because it is quite a star show.
Continue to get questions about that from everyday folks to broadcast meteorologists with PhDs. So if it's not something that you're familiar with, it can look a little odd. It looks like, a bright dot's mother duck and her ducklings falling along behind it. But on the unscheduled disassembly, kind of to circle it back to weather, a really good follow on Twitter. I'm not calling it X. Sorry. I'm going to continue calling it Twitter. A really good follow on there is the NWS Spaceflight Twitter account. They tweeted this morning a really cool image from the GOES satellite showing that debris field in the atmosphere, and it strewn pretty far, but you can actually see it from geosynchronous orbit from the weather satellites. And we often see that with launches, either the heat plume or actually rocket fuel when it's burned tends to create, at least in part, water. So a lot of the water vapor products will show the launch pretty clearly.
Well, we'll talk next hour about the Carolina Weather Group, Kennedy Space Center, and Crew 7 launch and some of the behind-the-scenes content we got there. But you reminded me that we saw that launch from weather satellites as well, too. So it's amazing not only the role that weather plays in, obviously, the launch, but actually the way the tools and everything can pick it all up.